The boarding gate at Dallas-Fort Worth buzzed with the typical chorus of rolling suitcases, impatient sighs, and muffled conversations. She had slipped into line quietly, clutching her worn leather tote and a half-finished bottle of water. The day had been long. Meetings, airport shuttles, endless lines, and all she wanted was to sink into a seat and vanish into the drone of jet engines. When her boarding group was called, she shuffled forward with the others, offering the attendant her ticket without a word. Row 22, Seat A, the boarding pass had read. Not too far back, not too close to the lavatory. She considered that a small blessing. Inside the aircraft, the familiar scent of recirculated air and faint coffee greeted her. The cabin was filling quickly. Businessmen with laptops already open, young parents juggling strollers and toddlers, college kids with earbuds jammed in tight, escaping into playlists. She maneuvered through the aisle, brushing past elbows and shoulders until she reached her row. Row 22, window seat. Exactly what she needed. She slid into the seat with a sigh of relief. The small oval window beside her framed the runway lights in the fading dusk, blinking rhythmically like beacons. She stuffed her tote under the seat, tugged her hoodie zipper up, and leaned back. The middle and aisle seats were still empty, and for a brief moment she fantasized about an entire row to herself. But luck rarely worked that way. Moments later, a tall man in a sports jacket dropped into the aisle seat, his cologne sharp and intrusive. A teenager with oversized headphones slumped into the middle, immediately claiming both armrests without shame. She offered a polite smile that went unnoticed. It didn't matter. The seat was hers, and so was the window. The flight attendants moved briskly, directing latecomers, stowing bags, and reminding passengers to fasten seatbelts. A safety demonstration flickered on the overhead screens, though no one seemed to watch. She had flown too often to pay attention. The motions were memorized: buckle, mask, exit row. She pulled the flimsy airline blanket over her lap, ignoring the chatter around her. The engines roared to life. She closed her eyes as the aircraft shuddered, taxiing onto the runway. A small vibration hummed through her seat as if the entire plane was drawing in a breath. Then, with sudden force, the plane surged forward, lifting into the night sky. Her body pressed into the seatback as they climbed. Lights below twinkled like scattered stars, gradually disappearing beneath a blanket of cloud. The cabin lights dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of reading lamps and the bluish hue of seatback screens. She exhaled slowly. This was her favorite moment of flying, that suspension between earth and sky, where problems felt smaller and the world below was nothing more than patches of shadow. The teenager beside her pulled out a tablet and began blasting a video game at full brightness. The man on the aisle ordered a whiskey the moment the beverage cart rattled by. She declined any drink, instead resting her forehead against the cool window. Her eyelids grew heavy. The day's exhaustion weighed her down, pulling her toward sleep. The soft drone of the engines lulled her further, blending with the occasional clink of glasses and muffled coughs. The seat wasn't comfortable, but it was enough. She let her thoughts wander as she drifted. Airplanes had always fascinated her. Thousands of pounds of metal, soaring through the sky, carrying strangers together in a shared silence. Everyone on board had their own destination, their own story, yet for these few hours, lives overlapped. The woman 2 rows up was cradling an infant, rocking gently as the child whimpered. Across the aisle, a young man in military fatigues leaned back, earbuds in, staring blankly at the ceiling. Somewhere near the back, a group of college friends laughed too loudly at something on a phone screen. All these people, trapped in the same tube of aluminum, breathing the same recycled air, heading the same direction. Her breathing slowed. The worries of work meetings, Unanswered emails and deadlines melted away. She had nothing to do here but sit, rest, and wait to arrive. The pilot's voice broke the silence for a moment, announcing cruising altitude, weather forecasts, and arrival time. She barely registered the words before sinking deeper into drowsiness. The teenager's video game noises blurred into white noise, and the whiskey smell from the aisle faded into the background. In that fragile space between wakefulness and sleep, her mind conjured fragments of dreams. Voices echoed faintly, impossible to place. A door slammed somewhere in memory. Then nothing but darkness. She was gone, lost to the rhythm of the engines, the gentle sway of the aircraft, the faint hum that felt almost like a lullaby. For her, this was just another flight, just another journey from one city to the next. No different than dozens before. She was a name on a passenger list, a body in a seat, a window gazer halfway between exhaustion and dreaming. But beyond her closed eyelids, life continued in the cabin. A flight attendant adjusted an overhead bin that had popped loose. A man in business attire typed furiously on his laptop, muttering to himself. 2 seats back, a middle-aged woman ordered her second glass of wine, her laughter a little too sharp. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested anything more than an ordinary flight. And yet, somewhere hidden among the 100 or so passengers, the seeds of something extraordinary were already planted. A restless traveler shifting uncomfortably in his seat. A set of eyes watching too carefully. A pocket of tension no one yet noticed. In row 22, though, she knew none of this. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, her cheek pressed against the window, the blanket tucked beneath her chin. She was asleep, deeply, peacefully, as though the world itself had paused. The quiet flight seemed destined to remain uneventful, at least for now. The cabin had settled into its cruising rhythm. Trays clicked into place, seatbelts loosened, and the low murmur of conversation blended with the steady drone of the engines. Some passengers scrolled lazily through movies on the seatback screens. Others already dozed, their heads bobbing gently with turbulence. It was the kind of quiet that fell over a flight once the initial rush of boarding and takeoff had passed. She had been deep in that fragile in-between state where dreams fluttered just beyond reach. But then, without warning, the intercom cracked alive, jolting her back into wakefulness. At first, she thought she'd imagined it, a stray sound woven into her dream. But the voice was unmistakable, firm and authoritative, echoing through the cabin. "This is your captain speaking. If there is a Delta Force sniper on board, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." The words hung in the air, sharp as shattered glass. For a heartbeat, silence fell, the kind that prickled the skin and made every ear strain harder. Then confusion erupted like a ripple across a pond. Passengers twisted in their seats. Some frowned, whispering hurriedly to neighbors. A few chuckled nervously, assuming it was a joke or misheard. But the pilot's voice had not carried a trace of humor. Her eyes shot open wide, heart thudding. She pushed the blanket off her lap, sat upright, and tried to process what she'd heard. A Delta Force sniper? On board? Why would the captain ask such a thing? Why now? She wasn't the only one rattled. 2 rows ahead, a mother clutched her toddler closer, pressing kisses into the child's hair. The teenager beside her finally paused his video game, pulling one earphone out. Even the whiskey-drinking man in the aisle seat stiffened, his eyes narrowing as if reconsidering every passenger around him. The hum of the engines continued steadily, yet everything inside the cabin had changed. The fragile sense of safety, that invisible bubble of trust between strangers in the sky, had been punctured. Another announcement did not follow. The captain's voice did not return to reassure or explain. There was only silence, heavy and suffocating, broken by a few whispered exchanges between passengers. "What did he just say?" Someone hissed a few rows back. "Delta Force. Like the military, right?" Another voice replied. "Why would they need a sniper up here?" A man muttered sharply. Her palms grew damp. She shifted in her seat, scanning the cabin as if answers might reveal themselves in someone's face. Everyone suddenly seemed suspicious, their movements sharper, their expressions harder to read. The flight attendants moved with unusual urgency. Their smiles were gone, replaced by tight lips and clipped steps as they whispered into phones tucked discreetly near the galley. She noticed one of them glance toward the back of the plane, her brow furrowing. It wasn't a joke. Something was wrong. Her breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. She pressed her forehead to the cool window, hoping the chilled glass would steady her. Below, the world stretched in darkness. No cities, no highways, only vast emptiness dotted with faint stars. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The teenager beside her broke the silence. "What's a sniper doing on a plane?" His voice was loud, cracked with youthful nervousness. His question carried further than intended, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. The man on the aisle cut him off with a sharp whisper. "Quiet." His jaw was clenched, his grip on the armrest tight. He didn't look like someone easily rattled, yet even he seemed unsettled. She tried to focus, to think logically. Perhaps there had been a threat, someone behaving erratically, maybe even violently. Air marshals were supposed to be on flights, weren't they? But Delta Force, that was something else entirely. That was military. That was serious. Her mind spun with possibilities, each darker than the last. A terrorist? A hostage situation? Or something stranger, a dangerous prisoner hidden among them? She shook her head, but the questions only multiplied. The whispering grew louder, swelling into nervous chatter. A group of college students craned their necks to peer down the aisles. A businessman near the exit row pulled his laptop bag closer, as though it might serve as a shield. The fragile order of the cabin was unraveling, replaced by fear's invisible hand pressing down on every chest. She forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Yet her hands trembled uncontrollably, and her stomach churned. This had to be some mistake, a miscommunication, perhaps even a prank. Pilots didn't joke like this, but maybe. Then she noticed him. 2 rows ahead, on the opposite aisle, a man shifted in his seat. He hadn't spoken, hadn't laughed nervously, or whispered like the others. He sat still, upright, his eyes forward. His expression was unreadable, yet there was something about his composure that stood out. Calm, controlled. Her gaze lingered, drawn to him. Unlike the others, he wasn't glancing around wildly. He wasn't whispering or fidgeting. He looked prepared. The intercom remained silent. The tension grew unbearable. Finally, one of the flight attendants approached slowly, her face pale but professional. She walked past her row, toward the man she had noticed. She leaned down and whispered something. His head turned slightly. Their eyes met. Then he nodded. Just once, firm and deliberate. A ripple of realization shivered through her. He wasn't just another passenger. He was the answer to the captain's call. The whispering ceased as people noticed. The atmosphere thickened, silence heavier than before. Hearts pounded. Breath caught in throats. Her own pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped the armrest. She had woken from an ordinary nap into something extraordinary, something terrifying. The captain's voice had been no mistake. There was danger here, real danger, and the man 2 rows ahead, calm, silent, resolute, was about to face it. And she, trapped in row 22, would witness it all. The cabin was no longer the casual space it had been moments before. Something invisible had shifted, a thread pulled tight, winding through every row, binding strangers together in a web of fear. What had begun as murmurs had now turned into watchful silence. Passengers sat straighter, eyes darting between the crew and the quiet man who had nodded at the attendant. The hum of the engines continued, steady and oblivious, but to those inside the plane, the sound no longer felt comforting. It was a reminder of how trapped they were, suspended thousands of feet above the ground, with nowhere to run. She gripped her armrest, her knuckles pale. The earlier comfort of the window seat felt like a cage now. She shifted, trying to ease the tension in her chest, but the air felt thinner, heavier. Every breath seemed to carry the weight of 100 others inhaling in fear. The teenager beside her fidgeted, his leg bouncing furiously. He had resumed his video game briefly, but the explosions and rapid beeps sounded too loud in the uneasy quiet. Eventually, he shut it off entirely, folding his arms and chewing on his thumbnail. Even he sensed the gravity of the moment. The whiskey-drinking man in the aisle wasn't hiding his agitation. His glass sat untouched on the tray table, the amber liquid trembling with each movement of the plane. He leaned slightly forward, as if ready to spring up, his eyes fixed on the aisle ahead. And then there were the whispers, faint, urgent. "Do you think it's a hijacking? Maybe someone brought something on board. Shouldn't there be air marshals? Why would the captain ask for a sniper?" The word sniper hissed between lips like a forbidden secret. Every repetition only deepened the unease. She swallowed hard. Her mind raced, conjuring headlines she had once skimmed in airport lounges. Attempted hijackings, passengers restrained midair, chaos at 30,000 feet. The difference here was the captain's call. Direct, specific, terrifying. Whatever threat lurked on board, it wasn't ordinary. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the man 2 rows ahead, the one who had nodded. He still hadn't moved. His posture was straight, his expression calm, almost detached. But there was no mistaking the shift in energy around him. People glanced toward him, then quickly looked away, as if afraid to stare too long. Was he really who the captain had asked for? A Delta Force sniper? It sounded like something out of a movie, not a late-night flight across the country. And yet, she could feel it. Something about him radiated control, a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the panic simmering in the cabin. The flight attendants worked quickly, but carefully, their movements stripped of the usual cheerfulness. No friendly banter, no smiles. They leaned toward each other, whispering in voices too low to catch. One disappeared into the cockpit, returning minutes later with a grim expression. Every detail screamed of something hidden, something dangerous. The minutes dragged, stretching longer than they should. The steady drone of the plane seemed louder, filling the silence between whispers. The seatbelt sign remained on, though the flight had smoothed out long ago. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Stay calm, just stay calm. She shifted in her seat again, pulling her hoodie tighter, as though fabric alone could shield her from whatever was coming. And then came the first visible crack in the facade. Near the back of the plane, a man's voice rose suddenly, sharp and erratic. "You can't tell me what to do. I have rights." The words carried forward, slicing through the hush. Passengers flinched, twisting in their seats to look. The voice grew louder, angrier. "Don't touch me. I said don't touch me." Her stomach dropped. So there it was, the source of the captain's call. A flight attendant's voice, trembling but firm, tried to calm him. "Sir, please lower your voice. We need you to remain seated." But the man's ranting only escalated. "You think you can stop me? You think anyone here can stop me?" The sound sent a chill crawling down her spine. This wasn't drunkenness or impatience. This was something more, something dangerous. Passengers began to panic in small, quiet ways. A woman clutched her husband's arm, whispering prayers under her breath. A businessman snapped his laptop shut, eyes wide. The college kids who had been laughing earlier now sat frozen, their bravado gone. She pressed herself against the window, trying to shrink into invisibility. Her pulse raced, her palms slick with sweat. She wanted desperately to unbuckle, to run, but where could she go? The walls were too close, the aisle too narrow, the doors locked tight. Her gaze snapped back to the man 2 rows ahead. He had finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. His movements were precise, controlled, as if every gesture carried intention. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. He didn't rush. He didn't draw attention with wild motions or loud words. He simply adjusted his jacket, exchanged a quiet look with the nearest attendant, and stepped into the aisle. Her throat tightened. The weight of the situation hit her fully. This wasn't a drill, wasn't some misunderstanding. The danger was real, and the man who had answered the captain's call was preparing to face it. The raving voice at the back continued to rise, cursing, shouting, words slurred but dangerous. The attendants couldn't contain him. Fear rippled forward, passengers leaning away from the aisle, pulling children closer. And through it all, the man walked steadily, his steps measured, his presence calm but commanding. In row 22, she couldn't look away. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow, but her eyes followed him as if tethered. She knew, without understanding, how that he was the only thing standing between order and chaos, between safety and disaster. The air grew heavier, tighter. The hum of the engines no longer masked the pounding of her heart. The silence of the passengers pressed in from every side, broken only by the shouts at the back and the quiet, steady footsteps moving toward them. Tension coiled tighter, winding around every row, every seat, every breath. Something was about to happen. Something that would change this flight forever. The man's footsteps echoed quietly in the narrow aisle, but to her ears they might as well have been drumbeats. Each step was deliberate, steady, and unhurried, the pace of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Passengers shrank back as he passed. They didn't know who he was, not exactly, but the shift in his presence was undeniable. People instinctively recognized control when they saw it. The nervous chatter that had rippled through the cabin earlier fell away into silence. It was as though the entire aircraft was holding its breath, watching, waiting. She pressed her forehead against the window again, unable to look away. Her pulse thundered in her ears. For a moment, the world outside, endless dark sky, faint pinpricks of stars, faded from view. The danger was here, inside, unfolding just a few rows away. The voice at the back of the plane rose again, a raw mixture of anger and something unhinged. You can't stop me. Do you hear me? Nobody can stop me. His words slurred and cracked, but his conviction was sharp enough to pierce the air. A flight attendant, trembling but resolute, stood her ground near him. Sir, please, you need to stay calm. Her voice wavered, her body angled defensively, as though bracing for impact. The man's answer was another outburst, louder this time, his fists slamming against the seat back in front of him. Gasps rippled forward. A child whimpered. A middle-aged man muttered something under his breath, clutching the armrest so tightly his knuckles went white. Through it all, the figure in the aisle kept moving. No rush, no panic, just quiet certainty. She noticed his hands, empty, relaxed, but not careless. His eyes, steady and focused, scanned the cabin with a soldier's precision. He seemed to absorb every detail. Who was panicking? Where the threat was seated? Which attendants were trying to intervene? When he stopped, it wasn't abrupt. It was natural, as though the spot itself had chosen him. He stood a few feet away from the shouting man, close enough to step in if needed, but far enough to avoid provoking him too soon. Then came the acknowledgement. He didn't introduce himself, didn't bark an order, didn't flash credentials. That wasn't his way. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward the nearest attendant and gave a single, firm nod. That nod said everything. It said, "I heard the captain." It said, "I'm here." It said, "This ends with me, not with him." The attendant exhaled visibly, her posture loosening in relief. She didn't need words to understand. But the passengers did. They shifted uneasily, whispering in urgent tones. "Is he? That must be him. God, I think that's the sniper." The word circulated again. A hiss carried on anxious lips. Sniper. Some found reassurance in it. The idea that a trained professional was here, among them. Others grew more nervous, realizing how serious things had become if the captain had called for such a person. In row 22, she felt caught between awe and terror. Her hands trembled in her lap, but her eyes never left him. He wasn't tall or broad, not the kind of figure one might imagine as a savior in a crisis. But there was something undeniable about him. The quiet authority, the stillness that spoke louder than rage ever could. The shouting man at the back hadn't noticed him yet. His ranting continued, words blurring together in fury and fear. "You think you're safe up here? You think any of this is real?" His voice cracked into manic laughter, then dropped suddenly to a whisper only those closest could hear. The shift was more unsettling than the yelling. The sniper, for there was no doubt, now that's what he was, remained calm. He leaned slightly toward the flight attendant, murmuring something too low for anyone else to hear. She nodded quickly, then stepped back, relief softening her tense face. Her mind raced. What had he said? What was he planning? The plane, usually alive with ordinary distractions, movie chatter, coughing, rustling of snack wrappers, was unnervingly quiet. Only the engines droned on, a steady background to the storm inside. Then, in a moment almost surreal in its simplicity, the sniper adjusted his stance. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just ready. His eyes locked on the erratic man, and though he hadn't spoken, the message was clear. He was watching. He was waiting. And he would not let this spiral further. Passengers sensed it too. The air shifted, tension bending around the quiet man in the aisle. For the first time since the captain's announcement, hope stirred. Fear was still heavy, but it was tempered by something else. Trust. The teenager beside her whispered, barely audible, "He's going to do something, isn't he?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, her heart hammering too hard for words. The whiskey-drinking man on the aisle exhaled, muttering under his breath. Thank God. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. At the back, the shouting flared again, louder and sharper, as though the erratic man sensed something closing in on him. His movements grew erratic, jerky, like an animal cornered. His hands clenched and unclenched, gripping the headrest in front of him with enough force to rattle it. Passengers flinched. Some ducked slightly, instinctively shielding themselves. A woman across the aisle pulled her child into her lap, whispering soothing words. The little one was too frightened to believe. Still, the sniper did not rush. He waited, letting the man burn himself out in anger, letting the cabin feel his steady calm. And in that pause, she realized something profound. His silence was more powerful than the other man's rage. One shouted and flailed, desperate to control the space with noise. The other stood quietly, unshaken, controlling it with presence. Her breath hitched. The contrast was almost unbearable. The captain's voice had not returned. There were no further instructions, no promises of safety. The responsibility now rested entirely on this man, The stranger who had risen from anonymity and acknowledged his role with nothing more than a nod. The quiet stretched, taut and trembling. And then the erratic man's eyes flicked forward, landing on him. Recognition flared, and his voice cracked into a shout. You! Who the hell are you? The moment of acknowledgement had passed. The confrontation was no longer avoidable. Row 22 leaned forward instinctively, her body trembling with adrenaline. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget this moment, when silence carried more power than words, when calm stood taller than chaos. And the storm had only just begun. The outburst at the back of the cabin no longer sounded like drunken rambling. It had an edge to it, something darker, sharper, more dangerous. The man's voice cracked through the silence like a whip, every word carrying a jagged threat. You think you're safe because you're in the sky? You're not safe anywhere. Gasps rippled through the rows. The once ordinary flight had now twisted into something far from normal. The comfortable illusion of routine, snacks, movies, polite conversations had been stripped away. She gripped the seat in front of her, her fingernails pressing into the fabric. Fear gnawed at her chest. The man causing the disturbance was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. Disheveled hair, wrinkled shirt, a wild fire burning in his eyes. His movements were erratic, jerking from one seat to another. He shoved aside a tray, sending a drink splattering onto the floor. A passenger yelped, pulling back in alarm. Don't touch me. The man roared, pointing a trembling hand at a flight attendant who had tried to calm him. His other hand fumbled at his jacket pocket. That movement froze the cabin. A dozen passengers gasped, their eyes widening, bodies recoiling instinctively. What was he reaching for? A weapon? Something hidden? Her stomach flipped, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't just shouting anymore. This was dangerous. The nearest attendant backed away quickly, her palms raised in a placating gesture. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, Sir, please stay calm. No one here wants trouble, but trouble was already here. The erratic man's fingers hovered inside his pocket, twitching. His eyes darted wildly, unblinking, scanning the rows as though expecting someone or something to confront him. His breathing was ragged, chest heaving, sweat beading along his brow despite the chilled cabin air. Passengers whispered in terrified bursts. Is that a weapon? Oh God, he's got something. Why isn't anyone stopping him? Row 22's heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the seat cushion, to pretend she wasn't here. But her eyes betrayed her. They locked onto the man, unwilling to look away, drawn by the primal need to know exactly where the danger lay. And then, movement in the aisle. The sniper. He hadn't rushed forward when the man shouted. He hadn't flinched at the slamming fists or the pocket reach. Instead, he had paused, observing, calculating. And now, in deliberate steps, he moved closer. Every eye followed him. The tension shifted, hope threading through fear. He wasn't loud, wasn't theatrical. He was steady, precise, a man built for these moments. When he stopped, it was with just enough distance to assess the threat. His voice finally broke the silence, low but commanding. Sir, one word, calm, firm. The erratic man froze, his wild eyes snapping toward him. Who the hell are you? His voice cracked, veins standing out along his neck. He staggered back a step, clutching the seat beside him. The sniper didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough, his presence the reply. Passengers leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats. The air felt too thin, the cabin too small. The erratic man's hand still hovered inside his pocket, twitching as though ready to pull something free. The sniper's gaze dropped once, then rose again, locking eyes with him. "Take your hand out slowly," he said, his voice even unshaken. "Show me what you're holding." The demand was simple, but the weight behind it carried authority no one else in the cabin possessed. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The engines droned on. The seatbelt signs glowed steadily. But inside the cabin, all sound faded except for the ragged breathing of two men. One calm, one unhinged. Finally, with a sudden movement, the erratic man yanked his hand free. Passengers gasped, some ducking down instinctively. But there was no gun, no knife, just a small black object glinting in the cabin light, a heavy metal lighter. Relief flickered briefly, a nervous laugh bubbling from a passenger in the middle rows. But the tension didn't dissolve. If anything, it sharpened. The man wasn't holding a firearm, but the way he clutched the lighter, the wild look in his eyes, made it clear this wasn't over. He waved it threateningly, his voice cracking with manic fury. "You think that makes me harmless? You think I can't do anything with this?" He flicked it open, a spark of flame hissing alive. A tiny firelight reflected in his eyes, turning his expression into something feral. He waved it closer to the seatback fabric, and passengers screamed. Row 22 clamped her hands over her mouth, muffling her cry. The thought of flames in a sealed cabin sent terror slicing through her. Fire was death in the sky. There was no escape, no oxygen, no chance. The sniper didn't flinch. His eyes tracked the flame, his stance adjusting subtly. Every fiber of his being radiated calm, control. "Put it down," he said. "Right now." But the man only laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "Or what? You'll shoot me? In here? In front of all of them?" His voice cracked again, words spilling into madness. Passengers huddled in their seats, trembling. A woman sobbed quietly, her husband pulling her close. The college kids clutched one another, pale-faced, all humor gone. Even the whiskey drinker muttered a prayer under his breath, his glass forgotten. The lighter flame danced dangerously, too close to fabric, too close to disaster. Row 22's heart pounded so violently, she thought it might burst. She couldn't look away. Every muscle in her body screamed to flee, but her seatbelt held her in place. Her fear glued her eyes to the confrontation. And then, with terrifying clarity, she realized something. The man wasn't threatening fire just for chaos. He wanted attention. He wanted to prove control. The lighter was a symbol, his weapon, his leverage. The sniper knew it too. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer, his movements deliberate. His voice was quiet, but its calmness cut sharper than the other man's shouts. "No one here wants to hurt you," he said. "But you can't use that. You know what happens if you do." "We all know." The erratic man's laugh faltered. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face. His hand shook, the flame wavering dangerously. "Stay back." He barked, though the words lacked the conviction they carried seconds before. The sniper tilted his head, studying him, his gaze never breaking. "You're scared," he said softly. "You don't want to do this." Row 22 felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The tone wasn't confrontational, wasn't aggressive. It was steady, empathetic even, but beneath it lay steel, a command unspoken. The cabin waited, breathless. The erratic man's flame sputtered, his hand trembling harder now. His wild eyes flicked around, meeting faces filled with terror, then landing back on the sniper's calm stare. And in that fragile, suspended moment, the balance teetered between catastrophe and containment, between madness and surrender. The tiny flame wavered, no bigger than the flame of a birthday candle. Yet inside the pressurized cabin of Flight 237, it felt like a roaring inferno waiting to consume everything. The erratic man's hand trembled, the lighter held too close to the seatback fabric. Passengers in the nearby rows recoiled, eyes wide, breaths shallow. A woman muffled her sobs into her hands. The faint smell of lighter fuel lingered in the air, sharp and unsettling. The cabin's silence was total, broken only by the whine of the engines and the ragged, uneven breathing of the man threatening them all. "Stay back," he shrieked, voice raw. His hand twitched dangerously. The flame flared brighter for a second, and the row nearest him flinched as one. The sniper stood his ground, calm, steady. His voice came low, precise, carrying over the panicked heartbeat of the plane. "Look at me," he said. The words cut through the chaos. Firm, measured. The erratic man's wild eyes flicked toward him. "I said stay back." But the sniper didn't move closer. Not yet. He simply met his gaze, unblinking, his presence a steady anchor against the storm. "You don't want to do this," he said evenly. "You light that, we all burn. Including you." The man's laugh was jagged, broken. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe we all go together." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Row 22's stomach lurched violently, her hand clutching the armrest until her knuckles turned bone white. The thought of flames inside this metal tube, 35,000 feet above the earth, was unbearable. The sniper's tone didn't waver. "You're not going to do that," he said. His voice carried the quiet weight of certainty, as though he already knew the outcome. The man's hand shook harder now. Sweat beaded along his brow, his chest heaving. He glanced around at the terrified faces staring back at him. For the first time, doubt clouded his expression. The sniper seized on it. "You're scared," he continued. "But you're not beyond saving. Put it down." For a moment, it seemed like the man might falter. His hand dipped slightly, the flame swaying lower. Relief stirred in the cabin. But then, in a sudden, wild burst of defiance, he raised it again, this time pressing the flame closer to the seat fabric, so close the heat shimmered. Passengers screamed. Someone shouted, "Stop him!" And the sniper moved. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was pure efficiency, training distilled into instinct. In 2 strides, he closed the distance. His hand shot out, striking the man's wrist with a sharp precision that sent the lighter clattering to the aisle. The flame snuffed instantly, the tiny threat extinguished. But the danger wasn't gone. The man roared in fury, lunging forward, his hands clawing. Spit flew as he shouted incoherently, his body fueled by adrenaline and rage. Passengers shrieked. A child wailed. Row 22's heart nearly burst from her chest. The sniper didn't flinch. He absorbed the attack with controlled movements, his hands snapping into position, twisting the man's arm behind his back. The man screamed, thrashing, but the hold was immovable. Every attempt to struggle only tightened the lock. The sniper's voice cut through the chaos again, low and commanding. "Stay down." The man kicked violently, his shoe striking the aisle wall. The noise echoed like gunfire in the confined space. Several passengers ducked instinctively, covering their heads. But the sniper was unyielding. He maneuvered the man with calm efficiency, pushing him down into an empty seat, pinning his arms. With one swift motion, he signaled the flight attendants. Restraints, now. They scrambled, adrenaline surging, fumbling with the emergency restraint kit tucked in the galley. Within seconds, nylon straps were passed forward. The sniper never loosened his grip, holding the thrashing man steady as the attendants wrapped his wrists, his ankles. The man screamed curses, his voice cracking with fury. "You don't know what you've done. You can't stop me. You can't," the words cut off as the gag was secured. His muffled protests continued, but the danger was fading. Passengers exhaled shakily, some collapsing back into their seats, others still trembling uncontrollably. A few whispered prayers of thanks. One man clapped his hands once, sharply, as though in disbelief at what he just witnessed. Row 22 couldn't move. Her body was frozen, her mind replaying the last few minutes over and over in dizzying detail. The flame, the lunge, the sudden, surgical precision of the sniper's response. She had never seen anything like it. The erratic man struggled weakly now, the restraints holding firm. His chest heaved, his face flushed with exertion. He glared at the sniper with wild eyes, muffled screams pressing against the gag. The sniper, breathing steady, crouched beside him for a moment. His gaze was unreadable, a mix of vigilance and something else. Calculation, perhaps, or a lingering readiness for more. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper meant only for the restrained man. "It's over. Sit still, and you'll make it to the ground alive." The man's eyes widened, a flicker of something, fear, maybe, replacing the fury. He slumped back slightly, his resistance weakening. The sniper rose, turning to the attendants. "Keep him restrained. Don't take your eyes off him." They nodded quickly, relief and awe mixing in their expressions. For the first time since the chaos began, the cabin began to breathe again. Passengers slowly lifted their heads, eyes wide, expressions stunned. Some exchanged whispers. Others stared openly at the sniper, as though seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was the line between survival and catastrophe. Row 22 finally inhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Her chest ached, her throat raw. She leaned back against her seat, trembling uncontrollably. The college kids beside her erupted in hushed chatter. "Did you see that? He took him down like it was nothing. Oh my God, I thought we were dead." The whiskey drinker muttered, "That's one hell of a man," shaking his head in disbelief. The woman across the aisle hugged her child tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered again and again, as though convincing herself. But for row 22, it didn't feel over. Not yet. Her eyes tracked the restrained man, still glaring, still breathing heavily. His outburst had been contained, but not extinguished. Something about his words lingered in her mind, chilling her. "You don't know what you've done." What had he meant? The sniper didn't relax either. His stance remained alert, his eyes sweeping the cabin, scanning every row, every face. He wasn't celebrating, wasn't even relieved. He was waiting, as though he knew this wasn't the end. And deep down, she knew it too. The storm had been contained for now, but its echoes still vibrated in the air, unspoken, unresolved. The real threat, whatever it was, might still be hidden. The man was restrained, his wrists bound tightly with nylon straps, his ankles tethered to the seat legs, a gag muffling his incoherent screams. The danger, at least in its most obvious form, had been neutralized. But the cabin was far from calm. The echoes of the chaos still lingered, etched into every passenger's expression. Some stared at the restrained man with wide, fearful eyes, unable to look away. Others leaned into one another, whispering in hurried tones, their voices taut with nerves. A few sat stiff and silent, their faces pale, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace. The faint smell of burned fuel from the lighter hung in the air, stubborn and sour. It was a reminder of how close they had come, a tiny flame away from disaster. Row 22 tried to slow her breathing, but her chest felt tight, her hands still trembling against her thighs. Her eyes kept darting to the restrained man, watching his every twitch. He wasn't calm, not even now. His body rocked against the seat restraints, his eyes wild and restless, filled with something she couldn't name. Across the aisle, the whiskey drinker let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Well, That's one for the books, he muttered. Almost lit the whole damn plane on fire. He tipped back the last of his drink, his hand still unsteady. A teenager beside her whispered, "Is it really over?" She didn't answer. She wasn't sure herself. The sniper hadn't returned to his seat. He remained standing a few rows away from the restrained man, his posture straight, his eyes sharp, sweeping the cabin like a radar. He wasn't satisfied. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the way his hand flexed slightly at his side, ready to act again at a moment's notice. The flight attendants, though visibly shaken, began moving carefully through the aisles, checking on passengers. Their voices were soft, their hands gentle, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. "Are you all right, ma'am?" one asked the sobbing woman across the aisle. "Yes," the woman whispered, clutching her child closer. "Thanks to him." She nodded toward the sniper. The acknowledgement rippled. More passengers turned toward him, their gazes filled with gratitude, awe, and something else. Curiosity, fear. He was no longer just another passenger. He was something more, something dangerous and necessary, all at once. But not everyone seemed reassured. From the back, a man in a business suit leaned forward, his voice low but carrying enough for nearby rows to hear. What if he wasn't alone? The words sliced through the cabin. Several heads turned sharply. Whispers began to spread, quick and sharp. Not alone? You think there are others? What if he's right? Row 22's stomach dropped. She hadn't considered that. The thought festered instantly, terrifying in its plausibility. The restrained man's earlier words replayed in her mind. You don't know what you've done. What if he had meant exactly that? What if there was more? The sniper's eyes flicked toward the murmurs, but didn't respond. He resumed his slow scan of the cabin, his expression unreadable. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Paranoia took root. People began glancing at one another, suspicion sharpening every look. A young man in a hoodie was eyed warily by the elderly couple beside him. A woman clutching her oversized handbag drew a sharp stare from across the aisle. The cabin wasn't united in relief anymore. It was fractured, splintered by fear. Row 22 felt it too. Every unfamiliar movement set her nerves on edge. A cough, a bag shifting underfoot, even the metallic ding of the seatbelt sign felt like an alarm bell. The captain's voice finally returned, crackling through the intercom. His tone was steady but taut. Ladies and gentlemen, we're aware of the situation in the cabin. The individual responsible has been restrained. Please remain calm, stay seated, and follow the crew's instructions. We'll be diverting to Denver for an unscheduled landing. The announcement should have been reassuring. Instead, it amplified the tension. Diverting meant this wasn't just a disturbance. It was an emergency. Whispers swelled. Denver? That's hours away. What if he breaks free? What if there are others? The restrained man thrashed suddenly, straining against the restraints, his muffled screams turning guttural. The nylon straps held, but the sound sent fresh panic through the rows. A woman clapped her hands over her ears, rocking in her seat. A man stood briefly, as though to move away, before being urged back down by an attendant. Row 22's heart thumped wildly. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, something they weren't prepared for. And then she noticed it, the sniper's eyes, sharp and restless. He wasn't looking at the restrained man anymore. He was studying the cabin itself, the passengers, the overhead compartments, the shadows. Her throat tightened. If he was still on alert, then maybe the danger hadn't passed. The minutes dragged like hours. Passengers shifted in their seats, their nerves frayed raw. The restrained man groaned through his gag, his eyes darting furiously. Some whispered that he was mad, Others whispered darker things, that he was a decoy, a distraction, a cover for something bigger. The paranoia spread like wildfire. Row 22 pressed her palms together tightly, her nails digging into her skin. She wanted to believe it was over. She wanted to trust the calm, commanding presence of the sniper still standing watch. But the words not alone pulsed in her mind, echoing louder than the drone of the engines. The cabin was no longer a safe space. It was a waiting room for the unknown. The boy beside her shifted nervously, glancing around. "Do you think he's right?" he whispered. That there could be more? She opened her mouth, but couldn't find an answer. Instead, she looked back toward the sniper. He was watching the passengers as much as he was protecting them, his eyes scanning faces, reading body language, searching for the next fracture in the calm. He knew something, or at least he suspected it. The storm was contained, but the air felt electric, charged with a danger that hadn't yet revealed itself. Row 22 swallowed hard, her gaze sweeping the cabin. Every passenger looked like a question mark, every movement a threat. And in that suffocating atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and silence, one truth burned clear in her mind. The flight was far from over. The announcement of diversion should have brought relief. Instead, it deepened the unease, stretching the cabin into a tight coil of nerves. Denver was still more than an hour away. For the passengers of Flight 237, that hour felt like an eternity. The restrained man rocked in his seat, his wrists and ankles bound, muffled sounds leaking from behind his gag. His eyes burned with fury, darting across the cabin like sparks. Some passengers refused to look at him at all, staring hard at the backs of the seats in front of them. Others couldn't stop watching, their attention locked in a morbid trance. Row 22 couldn't look away. She wanted to, desperately, but her gaze kept returning to him, as if the danger would grow if she dared to glance elsewhere. The boy beside her whispered again, his voice tight. "What if there really are more?" She didn't answer. She didn't want to give the fear words. The sniper hadn't sat down since the incident. He stood in the aisle, a few rows forward from the restrained man, posture straight, eyes sweeping continuously. His presence was a wall, silent, immovable, prepared. He wasn't watching for gratitude or acknowledgement. He was watching for cracks, for shadows, for anything that didn't belong. The passengers felt it too. He wasn't at ease, and so none of them could be. Minutes dragged into a heavy silence. The attendants whispered among themselves, their smiles brittle, their movements stiff as they passed cups of water to trembling hands. A few passengers muttered prayers. A woman clutched a rosary so tightly the beads dug into her skin. The engines droned on, indifferent to the storm inside. Then a sound. It was subtle, the faint click of an overhead bin latch. A passenger in row 17 shifted nervously, claiming they had only been adjusting their bag. But the sound sent ripples of tension through the cabin. Heads snapped around. Murmurs rose sharply. "What was that?" "Did you see?" "Something's in there." The restrained man let out a muffled laugh, his body shaking with it. The sound was hideous, echoing through the cabin. His eyes gleamed with something triumphant. Row 22's blood turned cold. The sniper was already moving. His steps were silent but certain, closing in on row 17. The passenger, a middle-aged man with sweat beading on his brow, raised his hands quickly. "I wasn't doing anything, I swear. Just fixing the latch." The sniper's gaze cut through him. He reached up, pressed the latch shut firmly, then turned his eyes back toward the restrained man. The man's laughter subsided into muffled, guttural noises. His body rocked harder against the restraints. The whispers swelled again. "He's not alone. There's more. We're not safe." Panic fed panic. Every cough, every shuffle, every movement became suspicious. A teenage girl clutched her backpack to her chest, as though shielding it from accusing eyes. A man in a hoodie pulled his hood lower, muttering angrily when passengers stared too long. Row 22's heart pounded. The cabin had become a hive of fear, buzzing louder with every minute. The sniper raised his hand once, a silent command. The murmurs hushed instantly. His voice was low, even, controlled. Stay calm. Eyes forward. Nobody moves without reason. It wasn't the captain speaking. It wasn't the attendants. It was him. And everyone listened. The hours stretched thin, every second a blade. The restrained man's energy ebbed and flowed, thrashing violently at one moment, slumping exhausted the next. His muffled noises came in waves, sometimes curses, sometimes laughter, sometimes unintelligible whispers that chilled the cabin. At last, the intercom crackled again. The captain's voice carried urgency now. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver. Law enforcement will be meeting us on the ground. Please remain seated until instructed. Relief should have flooded the cabin. Instead, the tension deepened. Descent meant change, and change meant unpredictability. The plane tilted downward. The lights dimmed. Passengers gripped armrests, some muttering prayers under their breath. The city lights below twinkled faintly in the distance, a promise of safety still too far away. Row 22's chest ached from holding her breath. Her mind replayed the man's words again. You don't know what you've done. What had he meant? Was Denver really safety? Or would something else unfold before they touched the ground? The restrained man twisted once more, his eyes wild, his gag muffling a scream. He slammed his bound feet against the seat in front of him, rattling it violently. The woman seated there shrieked, clutching her husband's arm. The sniper moved instantly, pressing the man back down with a controlled grip, his voice low, calm. Stay still. The man thrashed once, twice, then slumped suddenly, his head rolling back, his chest heaving. For the first time, his energy seemed broken, drained. Passengers exhaled shakily. The descent continued. The city lights grew larger. The wheels thudded down. The cabin shook with turbulence, but no one spoke. Silence ruled, broken only by the engine's roar and the muffled sound of restraints straining against a defeated prisoner. When the plane touched down, the relief was explosive. Some passengers clapped weakly, others cried, still others sagged into their seats, drained of everything. But no one moved. They waited, exactly as instructed, their eyes fixed on the man who had nearly brought them all to disaster. The aircraft slowed, taxied, and finally halted on a remote stretch of tarmac. Outside, flashing lights pierced the night. Police cars, emergency vehicles, silhouettes of armed officers waiting. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss. Cold night air rushed in. Law enforcement boarded swiftly, their weapons drawn, their faces hard. They surrounded the restrained man, pulled him upright, and marched him down the aisle. His muffled screams grew louder as he was dragged away, echoing like a ghost through the cabin until he was gone. For a moment, the plane was utterly still, empty, hollow. Then slowly, the passengers began to stir. The whispers returned, softer this time. Gratitude, disbelief, shock. The attendants moved again, guiding people calmly, methodically. Row by row, passengers disembarked, stepping into the waiting buses. Their legs shook as they touched the solid ground again. Row 22 lingered in her seat, her body heavy, her eyes fixed on the sniper still standing in the aisle. He hadn't left with the others. He remained, silent, watchful, as though he couldn't quite release the role he had been forced to claim. She stood slowly, hesitating. For a moment, their eyes met. There were no words, none that could capture the storm of the night. Not gratitude, not fear, not awe. Just silence, heavy with meaning. Then she turned, stepping into the aisle, moving toward the exit. The cool night air kissed her face as she left the plane, her lungs aching with relief. Behind her, the sniper disappeared into the shadows of law enforcement and flashing lights, his presence already fading into the fabric of the story. Not a passenger anymore, not even a man, but a legend whispered in row 22 for the rest of her life. And as she boarded the bus, the memory burned into her mind. She had been dozing in row 22, and the captain had asked for a sniper. And she had watched calm defeat chaos at 35,000 feet. She knew she would never sleep the same again.